In my article, Black Minstrelsy on Canadian Stages, Nostalgia for Plantation Slavery in the 19th and 20th Centuries, published in the Canadian Historical / La Société Historique du Canada in winter 2021, I provide one of the first in-depth discussions about the rise of Black minstrelsy in Canada. Compared to white minstrelsy, as Yuval Taylor and Jake Austin have argued, Black minstrelsy usually treasured, represented, or reinforced established negative stereotypes of Black people. Where white minstrels claimed to be pupils or even kin of the Black people they mocked, they also passionately made clear that they were white, a distinction that was often made through lithographic promotional posters. Black minstrel shows, however, were promoted by their management without any distinction between performer and performance, and were thus sold to white audiences as, quote, authentic representations of Black life, end quote, such as the original Georgia Minstrels, the first all-Black minstrel troupe organized at the conclusion of the U.S. Civil War in 1865, who were managed by an African-American, Charles Barney Hicks, who is commonly viewed as the father of Black minstrelsy. Once African Americans became marketable as entertainers, it was generally white managers who reaped the profits. Charles Callender, W.H. Lee, Sam Hague, Jack J.H. Haverly were among the 4 leading managers of all Black troupes. Principal comedian Billy Cursands once described as, quote, the greatest comedian living. Songwriter James Bland, known for his song Carry Me Back to Old Virginia, 1878, discussed in episode 1 and recorded in 1914 by opera singer Alma Gluck, as well as Horace Weston, a musician known as possibly one of the greatest banjo players of all time, who was also a dancer and actor, all toured Britain several times before joining Haverly's troupes, and they were all breakout Black stars performing in and out of blackface during their careers, which spanned the late 19th century to the early 20th century. Cursan started performing with Callender's Georgia Minstrels in the 1870s, singing such songs as Old Aunt Jemima. He became renowned for his slow-witted, big-mouthed Black caricature. Initially, Black minstrels performed as if they were white minstrels performing Blackness, but over time, as Black actors like Cursan became famous, Black minstrelsy developed its own authentic forms of dance and song that was distinct from white minstrelsy. While white minstrels had made themselves up to appear to have huge mouths, for example, Cursands made his own unusually large mouth, often out of blackface, one of the central features of his act, and eventually a core tenet of Black minstrels in general, so audiences knew they were going to see the real thing, not white imitators performing the real thing. While this sounds incredibly offensive by today's standards, if you consider the context of the 19th century, especially the Reconstruction era, 1865 to 1877, and the decades that followed throughout Vaudeville, Black lives were restricted through Jim Crow laws, limited employment opportunities, and geographic racism, exercised formally in the U.S. through practices known as redlining and restrictive covenant codes, and informally in Canada through similar restrictive covenants, though lesser is known about redlining practices north of the border. Thus, the mere presence of Black entertainers who were internationally known is quite extraordinary. Ultimately, vaudeville, with its segregated seating and the prominence of racial stereotyping in its productions, was one of the many institutions restricting Black freedoms following Reconstruction, inasmuch as it provided opportunities for Black entertainers. Vaudeville performance coincided with an influx of immigration from Eastern Europe, as well as with corresponding debates about the place for racial and non English-speaking ethnic populations in North American society in general. We explore the rise of the Black entertainer of stage and screen who, from the 1920s onward, reached new heights out of blackface. We will talk about Jubilee singing, Black newspapers, and the role they played in resisting some of the ubiquitous myths about Black people that originated from the theater, among other places. The changing milieu in the 1920s through 1950s would lead to the eventual curtain call on blackface at the theater. At the same time, blackface repertoire retreated into white communities, where they found a new home in amateur productions.